criminally convicted, I believe here, their protest was disproportionate and unreasonable.
Yeah.
And you're saying here, if I understand you right, this is now the law in England, that disproportionate and unreasonable, according to a judge, is the limit of the free speech of an Englishman?
Well, we have so many new, the phenomenon of the new Labour government, which came to power in 1997 and is still ruling and will probably be thrown out of office this year, I expect. But under the new Labour government, we've had so many new laws and crimes created, and most of them are kind of directed at controlling what people can do and what people can say and how people can behave. And there have been numerous amendments to laws or new laws which basically criminalise certain forms of speech. So there have been amendments to laws on incitement, so you now can be accused of inciting hatred by giving an inflammatory speech or by talking too loudly or by saying hateful or abusive things about other people. There are new laws governing how loudly you can protest on demonstrations, what you can say on them, how angry your placards can be, all sorts of regulations governing our right to protest and our right to free speech. And so, as you say, these guys were found guilty of unreasonable protest and disproportionate anger. And so it's come to the situation where a magistrate, a kind of, this individual judge can decide when someone's anger is good and when it's bad, when someone's protest is acceptable and when it's unacceptable. So in other words, there is no real free speech and there is no real right to protest, because if a judge can say that protest went too far or that speech was too inflammatory, then it means there is no free speech and there's no right to protest. So it was a very, very worrying case. And as I said earlier, the fact that it was left to these 7 Islamist individuals who don't really care about freedom, we can see that from the statements they've made over the past few years, but the fact that it was left to them to wheel out Voltaire really showed that the mainstream British society is in a pretty bad state.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And of course, I mean, hell, as I learned this, before I was 10 years old, I think that the whole point of the law is that even if it's Satan, you give him a fair trial because it's not about him, it's about you and that kind of thing. It's better to let 1,000 guilty men go free than to destroy the life of one innocent man by locking him up in a cage where, this is not, if this is the Enlightenment, I don't know what took humanity so long, but I learned it before I was in the double digits of years around, times around the sun here, and it doesn't seem so difficult for me to understand. I can't imagine how anyone's really willing to just throw all of this away over wartime arguments. We're dealing with this in the United States too, this stolen valor thing, where not fraud, right? Not where someone pretends to be, I was a Navy SEAL, and then they go and get a free car out of it, but just saying, I was a Navy SEAL in the bar or something is enough to now get someone prosecuted in the United States, and we'll see if that stands.
It's extraordinary. And I think the key thing with free speech, which people sometimes overlook, is that it's not only the individual speaker whose rights are being attacked. It's not only these 7 individuals in the British case whose rights are being undermined. It's everyone's, because free speech is an attack on the speaker, but it's also an attack on the audience. It's also an attack on the public, because what the state is effectively saying is that we don't trust the public to hear these views without going off and doing something crazy in response to them. So speech is curtailed both as a way of punishing the speaker because he's seen as having gone too far or said too much or whatever, but it's also controlled because the state has this view of the public as a kind of unpredictable ticking time bomb of fury and hatred. And if we hear an Islamic spouting nonsense, or if we hear a right-wing Christian guy, or if we hear one of your shock jocks, Michael Savage is still banned from coming to Britain because our government thinks if we hear his views, we'll go out and attack minorities. So the argument is that the British public is too volatile and unpredictable and probably a bit stupid, and if they hear these views, they will just react to them. So it treats us all as kind of attack dogs, where we hear an instruction and we go out and attack people. So it's deeply patronizing of the public as well. So I think we ought to defend people's free speech, not because I think these Islamists have got anything particularly interesting to say, but because free speech has to be universal. Either everyone has it or it doesn't exist. And also because I trust the public to hear these views and to rationally decide whether they are good or bad.
Well, yeah, that's the real point, right, is whether we have a market of ideas or not. And this is another thing that it seems to be a basic kind of truth that we learn as kids, which is that, at least this applies to the adults. The theory goes that once you're an adult, you have at least somewhat a responsibility to know how things are and make them better, and that you can, and that we're not living in the age of the divine right of kings. We're supposed to have, you guys have a parliamentary system. This is supposed to be a constitutional republic here, and the whole theory goes that we all are capable of reason and self-government and figuring out what's best. So censorship of arguments it leads to distortions.
Yeah.
And, for example, it makes Holocaust deniers feel vindicated when they're outlawed from speaking, when actually, someone ought to be able to defeat a Holocaust denier in an argument pretty easily, but instead they get to claim the moral high ground.
Absolutely. That's really true. The other problem with free speech is that all these ideas, which, some of these ideas really are backward and crazy and stupid or untrue. But as you say, the only way to defeat that, the only way to put it right, is to have a full-on public debate and full freedom for all views. John Stuart Mill said the only way a human being can know if he is right or not is by having a completely free and open public debate. It's the only way in which you can know that you are right. So you can't ban other people and say, I'm right because I've banned them. It just doesn't add up. Absolutely. The danger with censoring things is that it just kind of pushes them underground. It never defeats the idea or challenges it publicly, so it allows it to fester like a pus on the side of, kind of normal society. And it gives them this kind of sense of glory. The people who have been censored have this kind of frisson of excitement. We are the good guys because the whole state is ganging up against us. So it just creates this kind of strange situation where ideas are never had out, arguments are never take place in a public realm, and therefore things are never fixed and sorted. So it just leaves everything in a kind of strange stasis.
I'm talking with Brendan ONeill. He's the editor of Spiked Online over there in merry old England. Or it used to be merry. All right, so now here's the other thing, too, is, not outright censorship, but, there was a ton of, a ton is not the right way to describe it. There's a very strong sense of fear pervading people in media, which they only had to fear for their jobs. I don't know what's so scary about losing your job, but in the run-up to the Iraq War, as Dan Rather called it, you'll get necklaced with the burning tire of not being a patriot if you dare to question the government. And this is something that you guys are going through, going back over the Iraq War and the lies that the politicians told. But you had a great article in The Guardian about all the wide and varied people who bear responsibility, particularly in media, for shutting out real anti-war arguments and pushing the craziest of war propaganda on the people of England and the United States in the run-up to that war. And this is a war that has, as we'll be talking with Michael Schwartz about a little bit later on, has caused more than 4 million refugees, as many as 1 million deaths, at least hundreds and hundreds of thousands of deaths, and, wreaked havoc for Western society as well as that of Iraq.
Well, the problem we have in Britain at the moment is that at the time that the war was being discussed in 2002 and then when it started in early 2003, lots of the media were very uncritical. They accepted a lot of the propaganda. They pushed forward all these kind of crazy stories that lots of us knew were untrue because we just asked some probing questions, as you ought to do. But what's happening now is that the media is kind of rewriting all that. And we have this strange situation. I never thought I would find myself saying this, but I sometimes find myself almost defending Tony Blair because he's now being demonized through this Chilcot Inquiry and through the media's reporting of the inquiry as the man who single-handedly took us to war. He duped the entire public. He warped our minds. He poisoned our minds with all these crazy stories. He led us astray. It's all his fault. And I think what's happening is that the media is turning him into a scapegoat for their own failures. And other politicians are also turning him into a scapegoat for their own failures as well in relation to Iraq. So I constantly find myself reminding people that 412 members of parliament in Britain voted for the Iraq war, and only 149 voted against it. Now, those 412 members of parliament are not so stupid that they were just duped and brainwashed by Tony Blair. They believed him because they wanted to believe him. And the media believed lots of his stories as well. So I now find myself in the very strange situation, because I am an anti-imperialist and I am anti-war, of saying, look, let's not just focus on Blair, because that's going to distort the history of this war. Let's have a proper understanding of why Blair could get away with what he did,